Hello and welcome to Journalist Hangout UK, the show where we discuss issues, both African and worldwide, which are affecting the continent. And we look at how those issues are seen at home and in the African diaspora. I'm Efwa Hirsch and I'm pleased to welcome our panel. Luisa Ngongbogwana, a broadcaster, Lamre Akinola, editor of African Business, and Io Johnson, journalist and specialist in African affairs. Welcome to you all. And we are talking on the day that President Trump is making a highly contested visit to the UK where we are right now. Among the many reasons that people are on the streets protesting is his history of misogyny and comments about women. Luisa, are we at a moment in time where women have actually achieved progress, or is this one of many signs that things in some ways are stagnating or even going backwards?
I'm forever the optimist. I don't think there's any stagnation. It's a natural process of evolution. It's just a lot slower than I would like it to be, because in the three tiers of oppression, you know, race, class and sex, sex is at the bottom. And who's more at the bottom than a black woman, and particularly an African black woman? So this is the dynamic of the layers of oppression that we're talking about. So when we talk about President Trump, who is the ultimate misogynist for any woman, anywhere, on any world, I would imagine, then Friday the 13th is an unlucky day for us to have to face him. But it's also an opportunity for us to really fine-tune this protest into a concrete demand, because we can speak generally about women's oppression forever, but unless it actually translates into concrete legislative changes, then what are we doing except just pandering to the issue like a token gesture, which would be the worst thing you can do when you talk about women.
And we are talking specifically now about African women. You know, we're all people of African heritage here. One thing I often wonder is how much African men self-identify as feminists. Lamre, do you consider yourself a feminist, and do you feel that this struggle is something that you are personally invested in as well?
I'm not sure how to answer that question. Do I consider myself a feminist? If that means I am in favor of humans having this equal sort of rights to living a dignified life, then yes, very much so. I personally...
If we define feminism as considering women equal to men in all respects.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's the same thing I said. And yes, of course, you would have to be coming from a very odd perspective if you disagree with that conclusion. Am I personally vested in it? All I can do is act in accordance with what I believe, which is people basically deserve respect, and regardless of where they come from and what their biology is.
I'm particularly curious, Io, as to your response to the question of your personal feminism. Tell me about it.
Well, we've all got a degree of feminism in us.
A degree of feminism?
Yeah, absolutely,
okay.
Because we've got mothers who are, some of us have kids who are daughters. So, no, family members. But I think the call for feminism is right from now. I mean, it's been going on since the 70s to the 80s and 90s and now, and we haven't really seen a lot of progress. I mean, what we've seen is stagnation, where women's voices have not been heard, where their rights have been curtailed, and in fact, in many, many countries, their efforts to stand for freedom and justice has been quashed completely. So, yes, I think there's room for improvement, but it's like everything else. Inequality is not just a feminine issue. We have inequality between blacks and whites. We've got inequalities among women themselves between mixed race and blacks. And we have inequalities in the job sector. So, and these often affect women more, but I think it's not exclusively a women issue.
So I think we can all agree, it seems, that there is a struggle for gender equality. It's not the only struggle. But Luisa, let's look at some of the specific issues affecting women, and African women in particular. We have still 66% of worldwide maternal deaths occurring on the African continent. We have sexual assault as high as for 1 in 3 African women, other things like sexual favours that schoolgirls are being expected to give to teachers to get through school. There are some really serious issues affecting the everyday lives and dignity and right safety of women on the African continent.
Yes.
Do you feel that we are progressing, and what do we need to make change?
I think we are progressing, but we have a dearth of useful political education to help people to truly understand the dynamic at play. We understand nationalism, and we can all get behind our flag and ask and beg and demand independence. But socialization is something that's never really been dealt with. And that's, I think, as African people, we need to start questioning our unquestioned traditions around the position of women. There are areas in Africa where people would be offended that you are wearing trousers. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done around socializing, particularly on the school level, to show, okay, no one's going to argue, like Lanre said, well, men and women, of course, you're people, you're equal. But the reality of it is our condition contradicts our well-meaning intention in our behavior. And the most articulate people revolutionary Pan-Africanists I've ever met have turned out also to be the most sexist people, because they haven't dealt with the issue of socialization around gender, because they don't understand what that means, and only women can take a lead in that.
And coming to your point, Ayo, I mean, it's true that if you look at the history of the Pan-African struggle, the struggle for independence, there were women front and centre of that movement who've essentially been erased. You know, they're not the names that we easily recall. Do you think it's fair to say that in the focus on race equality, on the independence of Africa, we sometimes forget that within that, there is also a gender struggle?
To be honest with you, Afua, we've had women who've stood for power, who've held power on the African continent and succeeded in doing so. We've had the head of the African Union being a woman. We've had the president of Liberia being a woman. But the question is not, it's what they did when they were women. Did they did they recruit more women to the flock? No, they didn't. Did they change the status quo so that women could be on top? No, they didn't. In fact, even in this country, we've got the Prime Minister being a woman. How many women do we have in Parliament? How many women do we have in the cabinet?
I'm talking about socialise the people to make the policy a reality.
No. What you can't do is change what society has already deemed you to become, which is, it's a shame, but society is not prepared to allow the level of change that we are talking about here.
We have got women in positions of power. We have countries like Rwanda where 2/3 of parliament are now women. We have female presidents like Helen Johnson Sirleaf in Liberia. Do you see the progress of women into visible positions of power as a positive step, or are they simply replicating the kind of male patterns of wielding power that have come before?
It's a very important question. I fear it is towards the latter, because state structures, power structures, be they corporations, be they governments, are essentially dehumanized structures. So I'm not convinced at all that, you know, having quotas as to how many women are in parliament changes the nature of how societies govern themselves. So there is a meta question, if you want, around, hang on, are these institutions actually fit for purpose in terms of building fair, civilized societies?
You work in business where the market rules. Do you see a change over your professional lifetime? Are there more women in positions of power in business and
it's the same dynamic there, if not even worse. There's this famous statistic that 1 in 5, you know, top CEOs has the personality of a psychopath. So you have to ask the question: do we want psychopathic women in power, right? What's the benefit of that? And this again comes back to the question of what are the structural dynamics of how these institutions are run. They're sociopathic, psychopathic institutions. It doesn't matter who runs them. They, you know, it's not suddenly going to become this benign entity. And I would say in the market, that's even worse than in the public sphere. But that's a slightly different conversation.
And this brings us neatly back to Trump, doesn't it? I mean, I'm not sure if he's had a formal diagnosis for psychopathy, but
I'd be surprised if he's not.
He certainly falls into this type of male leader. Are we actually rewarding these very gendered and anti-feminist versions of power in Africa, among leaders in Africa too?
Yes, we are, always have done. It's part of and embedded within our tradition, the patriarchal tradition. But also, if we go far back enough in history, there are many examples in African culture of matriarchal societies, and very inspirational too. But you're not going to be reading about them. Your kids won't be educated about that, Ayo, to get a sense of how that could work, so that we can start creating new models, if you like, you know, of society.
Do you think we need a more African version of feminism?
That's what I was going to come to, because having been involved in what would be called the feminist movement, because there was nothing else, I used to work for Spare Rib, and people will immediately call you a feminist. And I'm going, okay, well, I'm just a human being who wants equality for everybody. But okay, you've put me in this box of feminism. Now, that's a Western white woman's issue. They want to be part of that gender dynamic of fighting for equality, but they haven't dealt with their own race issues. Therefore, they can't deal with black women. So because of all these layers, this feminism issue is not helpful for us as women unless we are all in agreement about the definition. But coming back to the particulars of our culture as African people, we have rooted in our society a philosophy called communalism, expressed all over Africa in many different ways in different tribes. Let's look to that and the writings of Kwame Nkrumah to evolve that, to create a society, a meaningful society that involves women, because Africa can do it.
What a brilliant note to end this half on, but it is time to take a break. So please join us in a few moments. Hello, welcome back to Journalist Hangout UK. I'm Efwa Hirsch, and I'm pleased to welcome back our panel, Luisa Mbokwana, Lanre Akinola, and Io Johnson. Welcome back, everyone. I'm going to have to start with you, Io, because you're so passionate about this issue. We couldn't stop you from talking about it during the break. And you were expressing some concerns that maybe men are losing out from the feminist movement. Do you stand by that?
Well, not exactly, but I think there's got to be a balance, because the feminine agenda has been fought for a long, long time.
And do you feel it's achieved equality?
Well, if it was equality you're looking for, then no. The question is, would you ever achieve equality? No, but because men are completely different from women. At least,
are you saying it's a given in human biology that men will always be better than women? Is that what you're saying?
Well, no. Well, if we're dealing with in the African continent, of course, be careful nonetheless. But if we're dealing with from an African perspective, we are a continent that's really engulfed by religion. And both Christian and the Muslim religion Islam are the two largest religions that govern the continent, and both of them follow a text which is very unified in the Old Testament. And that called for, they would naturally go back to the Adam and Eve situation, saying that their psychology, some of them, saying that the men came before the women. So we have a traditional thing indoctrinated in African minds, which is not going to be changed overnight, which is why when you have kids that are born, if a family has more girls than no boys, you find that there's added pressure to try and get a boy child, and this sums up back the mentality and the psychology that you need a male in the family.
It's an interesting point, Lanre, that faith has, and it's not unique to the African continent that there is faith, but we know that faith attendance and belief is disproportionately strong in many African countries. Do you think this is a factor holding back equality, people's interpretations of religious doctrine?
Very much so. The point has already been made. It's a fundamental point. Social attitudes are hugely significant when it comes to questions of social progress, and unfortunately traditional attitudes are often quite backwards. And for things like gender equality, sexual equality, anything that makes people uncomfortable, society is generally not prepared for it, which is not an excuse, it's not a justification, but that's just the reality. But I just want to come back to the point you made earlier, which is linking it to the market economy, which I think is really important here. The ultimate goal in driving gender equality should be to contribute towards fairer and more just societies. That ultimately is what we all want, right? We want to live in a place where I'm respected, you're respected, and unless we do something bad, we're kind of left to our own devices. I'm not convinced that's possible in the context of the market economy. So whatever progress is made in terms of gender equality will still come up against what I think is the much bigger wall of economic inequality, which is being reinforced at the moment more than ever before. So it's almost like you're dealing with a symptom of a bigger problem here. Just because you can now go and work as much as a man doesn't mean you're less exploited. It could mean you're being more exploited, actually.
And this is something that's very familiar to women of all races in the diaspora, in Europe and America, that women are not being paid for their labour, that they suffer penalties in the job market. But Louisa, we're at a moment now where there is this Me Too movement that has raised gender equality and sexual harassment to an unprecedented level of visibility. Is it actually helping black women, African women, women in the diaspora with the everyday experience of discrimination, inequality, oppression?
Even though it's a small minority of people, relatively speaking, that get the headlines because they're rich, let's not forget the positive impact of that. The publicity reaches people who might never consider this issue. And also African women's issue will get conflated into this bigger Me Too issue, like the total shutdown campaign in South Africa. The total shutdown campaign is asked everybody to get out and stop working so that the country can literally shut down. It's a kind of symbolic pause, in effect, for people to focus on the systemic violence, gender violence against women in South Africa. Not just South Africa, but it's particularly focused in South Africa.
But pretty selfish,
where the figures are very, very harrowing about the level of violence women and intimidation women face. It's almost like whatever frustrations are around the lack of implementation of apartheid policy, anti-apartheid policies, all those frustrations with the 21 years of nothing changing come in on the women. And that's what happens in all societies. Where things aren't working, the ones at the bottom of the pile are the ones who are going to suffer the most. And I see the total shutdown campaign as drawing everybody to say, whoa, let's address the root of the issue, the lack of education and socialization at the most basic level. No legislation will make any difference until that happens.
And the total shutdown is going to take place in a couple of weeks on
August
on
the 1st is the day. August is the month of the Women's Day particular focus, but August the 1st is the particular day. But every Wednesday and Friday, women are wearing black and red. The blood of African women, black and red, to symbolize that. And it's getting no headlines in the West.
I heard you use the word selfish in response to the total shutdown campaign.
Yeah, because I heard total shutdown of one of the biggest economies in the African continent. And of course, when you think about South Africa, when South Africa has a cold, the rest of Africa starts sneezing and all the rest of it. So
for one day.
Well, nonetheless, so I think selfish from that perspective want you to use an agenda like that to shut down. But I want to bring the statistics
would you have said the same about marches during the civil rights movement to fight against segregation or the campaign? I mean, it caused economic damage when you have protest movements, but do you not think that...
Never at any time did I hear Martin Luther King say shut down the whole of the US economy for one day for his cause. Never did he do that.
And would you have thought that was selfish if he
Well,
had
I don't think it's
that?
right. Shutting down any economy is bad news because it affects, there's an effect long term that goes beyond that. But I just want to bring a statistic to you. Do you know that the more equality that women ask for in the developed nations, which we have here, the divorce rates have gone up the roof. Whereas the statistics say that in African countries where that inequality is not as evolved, the divorce rates are pretty good.
So it's better for women to stay
I'm
in
not
unequal
I'm only
marriages.
sharing you what the intelligence says.
No, but what's your interpretation? Because the suggestion seems to be it's better for women not to have the right to leave or have an equal marriage
what it shows,
than to get divorced.
Well, don't shoot the messenger now, but what it shows is that the more liberalized you become as a feminist and as a woman as asking for more, the statistics suggest that you ask for that much
All
more
that tells
and leave
us
your
is
husband.
most marriages are unhappy.
Well, I'm just trying to
doesn't
tell
tell
you.
us anything substantive. And it's a good thing if a woman now has the confidence to leave an abusive husband. It's not a bad thing.
No, there's nothing about abuse. We never talked about abuse. We're just talking about statistics showing divorce.
That's what the
Don't hide behind
the
statistics.
total shutdown campaign is focusing on the unvoiced group of people, people with no voice who are getting beaten at home every night. The abuse, the domestic violence.
No one's talking about those.
things that are done in the name of tradition. Yeah. I'm the man, what I say goes, slap, slap.
No, nobody said that.
Let me bring Lamre back in.
Lamre,
I think what Ayo's saying goes to a fear that many have, which is that if we support gender equality and feminism on the African continent, we're secretly bringing in another culture. This is the kind of backdoor route to losing our cultural identity. What do you say to those kind of fears?
I think it's ridiculous.
Well, then probably he's got no identity himself.
I think it's ridiculous. Just
Who
like
hasn't got?
just like right-wing populism is ridiculous, that doesn't mean it's not a powerful force, but that doesn't in any way legitimize it. I think that's an absurd
And
argument.
I was just questioning your Africanness by the very fact that you were willing to take a stand in favour of equality.
I never said that.
You said
Well,
he's
not
an
in favour of
at all.
Africa, not in favour.
But is this the kind of thing that happens if you take a stand on these issues? Do people question your very
Aya's trying to push
legitimacy?
buttons. If we're looking forward, what does it mean? I'm African. I'm not African. The questions we're talking about here today are about just and fair societies. That's something every human being desires. It's completely disconnected from how you identify with yourself. Everyone wants a dignified life and an opportunity if you actually apply yourself to actually be successful.
Precisely.
And if there are fictitious barriers to that, if there are artificial and deliberate barriers to that, that's an injustice, and that injustice needs to be addressed. It's that simple. Whether that's gender, whether that's race, whether that's age, it doesn't matter, or it shouldn't matter.
And I second that.
Yeah.
Well, so we have some progress.
We
Louisa, I want to ask you, we've got the total shutdown in a couple of weeks in South Africa. We've seen women in Liberia, for example, going on strike so famously over the war and their treatment, at the hands of their husbands and men in Liberian society. Do you think that in a way things have to get so bad for women in a society to get so radical? Because we haven't seen the same level of protest across the African continent to stand against misogyny and gender-based violence.
It's a measure that tells us how far we need to go to actually make women an everyday topic. So when you have a situation like the liberation struggle, the women in Zimbabwe were lauded, women in South Africa, Winnie Mandela, the women in Eritrea carrying guns, wonderful images of equality. But as soon as the so-called liberation struggle was over, we defaulted straight back to our usual traditional understanding. And why must we always be in crisis to treat each other with respect?
And these are the questions we will continue to ask. I'm afraid we have to leave it there now. But don't forget to follow us at RealJHUK on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. I'm Efwa Hirsch, and from the entire team in London, goodbye. And thank you for watching Journalist Hangout UK.